May 24th, 1943. Navy Ministry, Tokyo. Rain taps the window panes in thin, nervous bursts, and the city below looks washed in grey smoke even when there is no raid siren. Inside the ministry, the air is hotter than it should be, thick with ink, sweat, and cigarette ash. A clerk slides a folder across a polished table. The paper edges softened from too many hands. Admiral Osami Nagano does not look up at first. He listens. There is the soft rasp of a map case being unlatched. A chair leg scrapes. Someone clears his throat and stops halfway, as if even a sound might be wasteful now. The officers gathered here are men who have watched fleets burn, yet they handle a stack of typed pages with more caution than they would handle a live shell. Nagano finally lifts his eyes. His gaze moves across faces that have not slept properly since Midway. Rear Admiral Shigeru Fukudome stands near the wall, a folder tucked under one arm, expression tight and controlled. Another officer, a staff captain with ink-stained fingers, grips a pencil until the knuckles pale. Everyone knows what the folder contains. Not a battle plan, not a signal intercept, not the confession of a prisoner. Ship counts. The pages list American hull numbers, yard names, launch dates, and projected completion schedules. Columns march down the sheet like infantry. In the margins, someone has added small notes in Japanese escort carrier, fleet carrier, light carrier, new construction. Next to several entries, a single character is written with heavy pressure, as if it had been carved fast. Nagano's fingertips press into the paper. He reads without blinking. In a different war, a fleet commander fears torpedoes in dark water, or the sudden hammering of dive bombers out of the sun. Here, in Tokyo, an admiral fears a calendar. Admiral Minachi Koga has arrived from the combined fleet with the look of a man who has carried the Pacific on his shoulders and found it heavier every month. He stands a step behind Nagano, hands clasped, uniform immaculate. The salt has not fully left him. In his mind, he can still taste Truck Lagoon's humid air, still hear the slap of waves against anchor chains, still see the empty berths where carriers should be. Koga speaks quietly, but the room seems to lean toward him. After the losses, he says, and everyone knows he means Midway. Guadalcanal, the long bleeding nights of attrition. We cannot replace quickly. We can repair, we can train, but steel and engines do not appear by will. Nagano turns a page, another set of numbers, another yard, another launch. The Americans are not simply building ships. They are building time, buying it in bulk, stacking it in warehouses, shipping it across oceans. Japan's shipwrights are skilled, her workers disciplined, her engineers brilliant, but the empire is fighting with limited ore, limited oil, and limited room to breathe. A staff officer lays out photographs, grainy reconnaissance images of American shipyards, long slipways, skeletons of hulls, cranes like tall insects. In the photos, nothing looks heroic. The cranes do not salute. The welders do not shout banzai. And yet, Nagano's jaw tightens as if he has seen a new kind of weapon. You can almost hear it if you imagine standing there in the rain outside the yard fence. Not the boom of guns, the steady, relentless clatter of industry. Rivets, torches, steel plates slamming into place, a sound that does not stop when the sun sets. One captain, trying to be useful, begins to speak in the language of tactics. He mentions night fighting. He mentions the superiority of Japanese torpedoes, the oxygen-fueled Type 93 that can reach out like a spear beyond American expectations. He mentions the spirit of the aviators, the skill that turned Pearl Harbor into a blaze and the Java Sea into a grave. Nagano does not cut him off. He simply holds up the paper. The paper does not argue back. Koga steps closer and taps a line with one finger, a projected completion date. His nail makes a tiny click. In 1940, Koga says, and his voice has a faint bitterness that doesn't need emphasis, they decided to build for 2 oceans. Nagano's eyes narrow. In the room, the date is remembered like a sickness that began unnoticed. July 19th, 1940. The 2-Ocean Navy Act, a decision made across the sea, in offices far from the Pacific's humid heat. At the time, it sounded like politics, like distant noise. Now it sits on Nagano's table in the form of hulls and tonnage and shipyard rhythms. It is not a law anymore. It is an assembly line. Fukudome shifts his weight. Their carriers, he says carefully, are not singular prizes. They are a series. A series? That is the terror. Japan can gamble on one decisive battle. Japan can concentrate and strike. But how do you defeat a nation that treats aircraft carriers like a repeatable process, like a product that can be stamped out again and again? Nagano looks at Koga, and for a moment the older admiral's composure cracks just enough to show what sits beneath it. Not panic, not surrender, something colder. Calculation, because if you are listening, truly listening, you can hear the future already arriving. One launch at a time. June 19th, 1943. Newport News Shipbuilding, Virginia. Heat ripples above the concrete like a mirage, and the air smells of burnt metal, paint, and river water. The James River lies broad and brown beyond the yard, crowded with barges and tugs, and above it all rise cranes so tall they seem to scratch at the clouds. Here, there is no silence. There is only work. A carrier hull sits on the ways like a dark continent. Men swarm over it in hard hats and coveralls, their movements practiced and impatient. Welding arcs flash bright as lightning and leave after-images on the eyes. A foreman shouts over the roar, pointing at a section of plating that must be fitted before the next shift arrives. The clock rules everything, but the clock is not the enemy. The enemy is delay, in the shade near a stack of steel beams. A Navy liaison officer watches with a clipboard pressed against his chest. He is not here to admire craftsmanship. He is here to ensure momentum. Every hour saved is a mile in the Pacific. Every missed delivery is another sailor somewhere out there who will go into battle without the air cover he expected. A worker wipes sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand and glances up at the massive hull. He does not know the names of Japanese admirals. He does not know the shape of Truk Lagoon or the taste of Guadalcanal mud. But he knows that the ship has to slide into the water on a date already printed on a schedule. The schedule is sacred. From this yard, from Bethlehem Steel, from Puget Sound, from Brooklyn Navy Yard, from dozens of places where the sound of hammers and torches never fully stops. America is turning the war into a problem of output. It is not romance. It is multiplication. And that is what frightened the men in Tokyo. Because out in the Pacific, Japanese officers still think in terms of singular, decisive moments. One strike, one battle. One night action where superior optics and disciplined crews and long lance torpedoes might shred an enemy fleet. But here, in the American yard, the war is not a single moment. It is a conveyor belt. A new section of flight deck is lifted by crane. The steel groans as it rises, chains tight as piano wire. Men guide it with ropes, their boots clanging on scaffolding. The piece swings into place with an almost casual inevitability. Someone slaps a gloved hand against the plating, satisfied, and the work continues without ceremony. The Americans do not need to win every exchange perfectly if they can replace losses faster than the enemy can recover. A damaged carrier can be patched, refitted, returned. A sunk carrier can be mourned briefly and replaced by another hull already halfway complete. A carrier group lost in battle does not end the war if the pipeline behind it keeps flowing. Back in Tokyo, the admirals have begun to understand this in the most humiliating way possible by counting. Midway was supposed to be an ending. 4 carriers gone in one day. Japan's best pilots burned with their aircraft. The battle did not just take ships. It took years. A trained deck crew cannot be forged in a furnace. An experienced air group cannot be poured into a mold. The Japanese carriers that remain now carry less than they once did. Not because of design, but because the human component has been bled. Koga knows this. He has read the reports of replacement pilots arriving with fewer hours, fewer carrier landings, fewer instincts. He has watched the training pipeline strain against fuel shortages and the shrinking margin for error. Even if Japan could somehow match American steel, could she match American gasoline? American factories, American spare parts, American training fields spread across a continent. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, men still draw arrows on charts. They still plan ambushes, island by island, with careful coordination between surface forces and air power. But behind every arrow is the question none of them can escape. How many carriers will the Americans have next month? How many the month after? In June 1943, the Japanese staff officers make their estimates and watch them become obsolete before the ink dries. Each time they think the Americans have reached a limit, another yard report appears, another launch, another commissioning ceremony, another workup, another task force sliding over the horizon. The fear is not only the carriers themselves, it is the ecosystem that surrounds them. Destroyers in numbers that make escort duty routine rather than desperate. Oilers that extend the reach of fleets across the ocean like arteries feeding a heart. Repair ships that can turn a shattered hull into a fighting unit again without sending it all the way back to Pearl Harbor. Cargo ships that keep Marines fed and airfields stocked. Planes that arrive not as precious jewels, but as crates. Engines wrapped in paper and grease, ready to be assembled and flown. A Japanese admiral fears a carrier because it brings aircraft. He fears an American carrier because it brings the promise of another carrier behind it, and another behind that, and another still, on the far side of the world. Koga stands at his desk with those same papers and tries to think like an American. He forces himself to imagine a war where losses are acceptable because replacement is assured. It is a foreign idea. It feels reckless. It feels obscene. But it is real, and reality is the enemy of hope. A young staff officer, voice careful, offers a suggestion: strike the shipyards, hit the factories, take the war to the American continent. The room goes quiet, not because it is bold, but because they all understand the problem. The distances are vast. Japan's long-range striking power is limited. Submarines can raid shipping, yes, but cannot demolish the manufacturing base. Carrier raids might sting, but not stop the conveyor belt. Bombers lack range, and even if a few yards were damaged, America has depth. There is always another yard, another line, another source of steel. Koga looks out a window at the humid night of truck in his memory, then back down at the paper reality in front of him. His mind returns to a single, unavoidable truth. Japan is not fighting a fleet. Japan is fighting a continent that has learned to build fleets as a habit. August 7th, 1943. Combined Fleet Headquarters. Truck Lagoon. The lagoon is a mirror of blue-green calm, broken only by the wakes of small boats and the slow swing of anchored ships on their chains. Palm fronds shiver in the trade wind. From a distance, truck looks like a tropical sanctuary. Up close, it feels like a waiting room. Inside a low, sweat-damp operations building. The air is heavy with damp paper and kerosene. Fans turn without conviction. A wall map of the Pacific dominates the room. Islands pinned like stepping stones across an ocean too wide to hold in one glance. Red flags mark Japanese positions. Blue pins creep forward. Lines show convoy routes, patrol zones, estimated American air ranges. Admiral Minechi Koga stands with his hands behind his back, posture rigid, the brim of his cap casting a shadow over his eyes. Around him, staff officers keep their voices low. They speak as if the map itself can overhear and punish them. The combined fleet has always lived by a certain faith-decisive battle. Lure the enemy west. Bleed him with submarines and land-based aircraft. Then finish him in one night of gunfire and torpedoes when his strength is worn down. It worked in theory. It worked in war games. It even worked in pieces during the early months of the war, when Japan's carrier aviators were the sharpest blades in the world and the enemy fleet seemed smaller, slower, uncertain. Now the theory collides with arithmetic. A staff captain steps forward with a fresh summary of American fleet movements and construction estimates. He uses a pointer on the map. But what he is really pointing at is time. He indicates the Central Pacific, the Solomons, the long route from Hawaii to the Marshalls to the Gilberts, and then on toward the Marianas. Every arrow he draws is backed by a hidden fact. American logistics can support the arrow. Koga listens, expression unreadable, and then speaks. "We can still win a battle," he says. No one contradicts him. They all believe it, at least in the narrow sense. Japanese night fighting is still deadly. The long-lance torpedo still runs far and hits hard. Japanese crews still train until muscle memory is carved into them. But Koga's next words are the ones that matter. "We cannot win a war of replacement." The staff officers exchange quick glances. The sentence lands like a weight. Outside, waves slap against hulls. Somewhere, an engine coughs to life. Life continues, but the logic does not. A younger officer, eager to be useful, begins laying out options. If American industry is the source, then the source must be disrupted. Submarine warfare, commerce raiding, starving the enemy of fuel and steel. Koga lets him speak. Then he asks a simple question. How many submarines do we have to spare for commerce raiding when we also need them for fleet scouting and battle attrition? The officer hesitates. The number is not large enough, not even close. Japan's submarines are excellent, but doctrine has chained them to fleet missions rather than systematic commerce destruction. Meanwhile, American convoy protection grows stronger every month. Escorts multiply. Aircraft patrol the sea lanes. Radar finds silhouettes in darkness. The ocean is becoming less forgiving. Another staff officer suggests pushing harder in the Solomons, turning Guadalcanal's disaster into a lesson. Fight where the Americans must come close. Use land-based air to reduce the carrier threat. Force the enemy into narrow waters where torpedoes and night actions can harvest ships. Koga turns toward the wall map. His eyes trace the chain of islands like a man reading a fate line in his palm. The problem is not whether the Americans will come close. The problem is that they can come close, withdraw, regroup, and come again with more. In a war between equals, every carrier sunk is a catastrophe. In this war, Koga is beginning to realize that every American carrier sunk may be a delay, not a turning point. A clerk brings in a second folder. Inside are translated summaries of American legislation and production goals. The pages mention the Two-Ocean Navy Act again, as if it is a ghost that refuses to leave the room. July 19th, 1940. On that date, in a place far from trucks, sweat, and mosquitoes, American policy had turned into steel quotas and shipyard expansions. The act had not been designed with Japan alone in mind. It was aimed at a world that had caught fire. But for Japan, the effect is the same as if the Americans had built their entire industrial machine specifically to crush her. Koga flicks his gaze over the figures. He does not need to memorize them. He only needs to understand the shape of the curve. Japan's curve rises slowly, constrained by resources, by bombing threats, by shipping shortages, by the growing danger to sea routes that feed the home islands. America's curve rises like a wall. One officer, older, with a face lined by years at sea, speaks in a voice that carries no illusion. "We may still inflict heavy losses," he says. "But if they replace faster than we can damage, we will exhaust ourselves. The words are not defeatist, they are practical. And practicality is what war does to romantic doctrine. Koga walks closer to the map and points to the outer defense perimeter. The wide arc of islands Japan has seized. Each island is a fortress in concept. In reality, each island is an outpost that must be fed by shipping and defended by aircraft that require fuel. He taps the Marshalls, then the Gilberts, then the Marianas with the tip of his pointer. If they take these, he says, their bombers will reach further. Their fleets will be closer, their repair and supply will be easier, and their production will still continue. A murmur moves through the room. The map is no longer just geography. It is a countdown. In the evenings, when the staff officers finally step outside, they can see the silhouettes of their ships against the dark lagoon. They look powerful in the moonlight, dignified, alive. But Koga can no longer see them without imagining the missing shapes that should be beside them. He thinks of carriers lost, crews lost, pilots lost. He thinks of the American yards that will fill the gaps on the enemy side as quickly as rain fills a footprint. He feels more than he admits. The creeping terror that Japan's best weapon may not be her torpedoes or her pilots or her doctrine. It may be the one weapon she cannot manufacture. Time, October 6, 1943. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. The air in the conference room carries the faint smell of damp wool and coal smoke. Outside, the city is busy pretending it is not under threat, but the blackouts and sand buckets and nervous glances upward have become part of daily life. Inside, the men around the long table speak with the careful politeness of people who know the walls have ears, and the consequences of pessimism can be worse than enemy bombs. Admiral Osami Nagano sits at the head of the table with a stack of reports that grow thicker each month. Army officers in green sit across from naval officers in dark blue. Between them lies a gulf that no map can bridge. Nagano has learned to choose his words like he chooses his battles. If he speaks too bluntly about American strength, he risks being labeled defeatist. If he softens the truth, he risks sending more men to die based on a fantasy. He opens a folder and lays out a new set of figures, the same kind that have been haunting the Navy Ministry since early 1943. Carrier completions, escort carriers, fleet oilers, destroyer output, aircraft production. Not every man at the table understands ships, but every man understands scale. An army general leans forward, eyes narrowed. He is a veteran of China, where time stretches differently, where a front can exist for years without a decisive conclusion. He looks at the numbers and then up at Nagano. "You're saying," the general begins, "that they are building faster than we can sink." Nagano does not flinch. Yes. The room goes still. Someone shifts a teacup slightly, and the porcelain makes a small click that feels too loud. Nagano continues, voice controlled. "Our tactics can achieve local superiority. Our crews can fight with great skill. But the enemy's capacity to replace losses is increasing. Their shipyards are producing aircraft carriers and escorts at a rate that changes the balance faster than battles can." An officer from the Naval General Staff, younger, sharp, tries to redirect the mood. He speaks of morale, of fighting spirit, of the willingness to sacrifice. He invokes the language that has become the Empire's armor against fear. "Our men will fight to the last," he says. Nagano nods as if acknowledging something sacred. "Yes, they will." Then he adds, quieter, "And the enemy will build another ship." That is the sentence nobody wants to hear, because it makes sacrifice feel small against a machine. A different naval officer, a technical specialist, spreads blueprints and notes. He speaks of new Japanese ship designs, improvements, faster construction methods, emergency programs. He mentions converting merchant hulls into carriers, building light carriers, trying to stretch limited resources by improvisation. For a moment, the room grabs at this like a rope. If Japan can adapt, perhaps Japan can keep pace. But Nagano has already seen the limits. He has seen the bottlenecks that cannot be shouted away. Steel supply, fuel oil, shipping lanes threatened by submarines, skilled labor pulled in too many directions, engines that take time to build, trained pilots that take time to train, airframes that require aluminum and specialized factories. And beyond all that, the greatest constraint: geography. America's factories sit behind vast oceans. Japan's factories sit within reach of bombers that are coming closer with every island that falls. A staff officer brings in an intelligence summary. It contains accounts from neutral diplomats, shipping observations, intercepted chatter. The same story emerges in different forms. American production is not slowing. It is accelerating. An army officer scoffs softly, trying to regain control of the narrative. Americans lack endurance, he says. They are soft. They will tire of losses. The line is familiar. It has been repeated so often that it has become a lullaby. Nagano's eyes move to the reports again. He speaks without raising his voice. They have found a way to endure by replacing what is lost. Their public sees ships launched. Their families see photographs. Their newspapers print numbers. It sustains them. The general across from him frowns, as if considering a new enemy he cannot shoot. At this table, the debate begins to shift. Not openly, not in words like surrender, but in questions. If decisive battle is no longer decisive, what replaces it? If the American fleet can absorb losses, how do you inflict pain that matters? If you cannot stop the shipyards, where do you strike? The answers that surface are grim. More aggressive submarine warfare, even if doctrine must bend. Attacks on supply routes. Stronger defense of key island chains. Preparing for a future where the enemy comes closer and closer, where Japan must trade space for time and hope. Time will produce a miracle. Someone mentions a miracle aloud, then stops, embarrassed, as if the word itself is treason against rational planning. The room turns toward the idea that has been whispered more than it has been said: special attack tactics, not yet fully shaped, not yet formalized. But the seed is there, planted by the recognition that Japan may need to exchange lives for results that cannot be achieved by conventional attrition. A captain speaks carefully. If we cannot match their production, then we must increase the cost of every ship. Nagano's face remains still, but his eyes harden. Increase the cost. That is what the war is becoming for Japan. A desperate attempt to make each American hull so expensive in blood that the enemy will stop building. But the figures on the table suggest the opposite. America's solution to cost is not fear, it is scale. Nagano stands and walks to the window for a moment, looking out at Tokyo's rooftops. The city looks calm, people move, life continues. Yet he can almost see, in his mind, the line of American carriers forming somewhere beyond the horizon, each one the product of a yard that never sleeps. He turns back to the table. We must understand, he says, that the enemy's strength is not only in ships at sea, it is in ships not yet launched. That thought chills the room more than any mention of bombs, because it means Japan is fighting not only what exists, but what is coming. November 20th, 1943, off Tarawa, Gilbert Islands. The sea is a hard blue sheet under a bright sky, but the water near the reef is churned white with violence. Landing craft buck and slam, engines screaming as they push toward the shore. Smoke drifts low and bitter, and the air is full of snapping rifle fire and the deeper, heavier thud of naval guns. From the beach, Japanese defenders fire from sand and concrete, from palm shadows and shattered bunkers. From offshore, American battleships and cruisers answer with disciplined thunder. Above it all, aircraft circle like metal birds. Their engines a constant growl that seems to fill the sky itself. To a Japanese observer, if one existed close enough to see through the smoke, the invasion would look like a moving city made of steel. Not one ship, not two, an armada. Carriers sit beyond the horizon line, their flight decks launching wave after wave, escort carriers and fleet carriers together, feeding the air like a furnace. Destroyers slash through the water in tight patterns, their wakes crossing like white scars. Transports and cargo ships stand in patient lines, each one a promise that more men, more ammunition, more fuel will keep arriving until the island breaks. For Japan, this is the nightmare made visible. It is not only that the Americans have ships here, it is that they have enough ships to waste time and still succeed. A flight of American fighters screams overhead, sunlight flashing off wings. They drop low, raking the beach. Then they climb, and another flight replaces them, and another. The rhythm does not falter. On the Japanese side, the defenders fight with fierce determination. They are well dug in, disciplined, prepared to die. They fire until barrels glow, until fingers bleed, until communications wires are severed and orders become hand signals and screams. But for every bullet fired from the sand, there is an answer in steel and aviation gasoline coming from ships that can be replenished, repaired, replaced. This is what the Japanese admirals feared when they spoke of American industry. Not an abstract output graph, not a legal act signed in Washington. The tangible result is here, crashing against coral and concrete. Back in Tokyo, Admiral Minichi Koga receives reports from the Central Pacific and feels the ocean shrink around Japan's perimeter. The Americans are no longer creeping. They are stepping forward in heavy boots. In the days after Tarawa begins, staff officers in Japanese headquarters gather around maps again. They trace American routes with their fingertips. They mark airfields, anchorages, potential landing sites. They argue about where the next blow will fall, but the arguments are haunted by the same invisible presence, American capacity. A loss at sea is no longer simply a loss. It is a subtraction that the Americans can erase. The Japanese carrier force, what remains of it, is being preserved like a priceless artifact, held back because it cannot be risked lightly. Every admiral knows that another midway is unacceptable, yet the Americans seem to invite risk. They throw carriers into harm's way because they can. Koga stands in a dimly lit room as a staff officer describes American carrier groups rotating through operations. They do not stay until they are exhausted. They cycle, they strike, withdraw, replenish, and return. The logistics chain behind them is smooth. Oilers meet them at sea. Ammunition ships arrive on schedule. Damaged vessels peel away and are replaced by fresh hulls. The staff officer's voice grows tight. Their tempo is increasing. Tempo. It is a musical word, almost gentle. But here it means something merciless. It means the Americans are setting the pace of the war, and Japan is forced to dance until she collapses. Koga thinks of his own ships. He thinks of fuel rationing. He thinks of the shortage of trained pilots. He thinks of aircraft that must be nursed and patched, of engines that cannot be easily replaced, of spare parts that arrive late or not at all. He thinks of the men who must be trained to land on pitching decks at night, who must learn to read the wind by instinct, who must fight and survive long enough to become veterans. Japan cannot mass-produce veterans, and now, neither can she protect the pipeline that would produce them. American submarines are tightening around the sea lanes like a net. Each month, more Japanese merchant tonnage disappears beneath the waves. Each sinking is another crack in the empire's ability to feed its factories, its cities, its fleet. Even if Japan has the blueprints and the shipyards, she's beginning to lack the blood in the arteries that keep them alive. The Americans, by contrast, seem to have endless arteries. In Washington and in shipyard towns, the war is measured in shifts, contracts, and tonnage. Women welders and machinists and riveters take their places. Trains arrive with steel. Trucks carry engines. The output curves upward. The Two-Ocean Navy Act is no longer a document. It is a tide on the deck of an American carrier somewhere near the Gilberts. A deck crewman guides a plane forward with hand signals. The deck is hot under his boots. The wind smells of salt and exhaust. He does not know the names of the islands the Japanese have fortified. He knows only that the flight schedule continues and the planes must launch. A pilot taxis into position. Canopy closed, face hidden behind goggles. The engine roars. The deck crewman drops his arm. The aircraft surges forward and disappears off the bow into open sky. Then another takes its place. Then another. From Japan's perspective, this is industrial power turned into air power, turned into inevitability. In a quiet moment, Koga speaks to his senior staff. His voice is low enough that only the men nearest him hear. "We must find a way to make each American ship count as more than one," he says. It is a strange phrase, but everyone understands. Japan must magnify her blows. She must compensate for scarcity with shock, for limited production with disproportionate destruction. And somewhere in that logic, the shadow of the future grows longer. Because when industry cannot be matched, desperation becomes doctrine. June 19th, 1944. Philippine Sea, west of Saipan. The horizon is clean and bright. A thin line where blue sea meets pale sky, and the wind across the waves smells of salt and aviation fuel. On the deck of a Japanese carrier, flight crews move with a tension that is almost visible. Hands quick, eyes sharp, voices clipped. Planes sit nose to tail, wings folded tight, engines warming, propellers a blur. The deck vibrates beneath boots. Somewhere below, machinery hums like a living thing. This is what Japan has left. A precious, striking arm, held together by discipline and hope and the belief that one decisive blow can still reshape the war. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stands in his flagship's island, watching the deck through binoculars. He is calm on the surface, but his mind is running on numbers that no prayer can change. Fuel is limited. Pilots are fewer and less seasoned. Replacement air crews have courage, but courage does not substitute for hours of practice. He can feel the weight of America's industrial shadow even before the first aircraft launches. Across the water, beyond the curvature of the sea, American carriers fill the ocean like a moving continent. Their task force is not a gamble. It is a system, multiple carrier groups, layers of escorts, radar pickets, oilers, repair capacity, and aircraft reserves so deep that losses are absorbed almost before they are noticed. This battle is not only a clash of fleets, it is the collision of two philosophies. Japan is betting on excellence and sacrifice. America is betting on volume and continuity. Ozawa gives the order. The first strike lifts off, aircraft rolling down the deck, leaping into the sky one after another. The pilots climb into formation, turning toward where they believe the American carriers are. Radio chatter crackles. The sun glints off wings. For a moment, the Japanese force looks like it did in 1941, a disciplined wave of steel and skill. But the ocean has changed since 1941. American radar sees them coming. American fighters rise in swarms. American combat air patrol is not improvised desperation anymore. It is routine, repeated, practiced, fed by a deck cycle that never seems to exhaust itself, high above the sea. The first interceptions happen in cold, thin air, tracer fire arcs, aircraft twist and dive. Parachutes bloom like pale flowers. The sky becomes a killing field, and the Japanese strike begins to thin before it ever sees a flight deck. On the Japanese carriers, deck crews look up and wait for returning planes. They listen for engine notes. They scan the horizon for silhouettes. Minutes stretch. Then the first damaged aircraft appears, trailing smoke, wobbling like a wounded bird. It lands hard, skids, sparks flying. The pilot climbs out, face gray with shock, and his words tumble out in fragments. Too many fighters, too much radar. They were waiting. Ozawa absorbs it with the stillness of a man watching an inevitable equation solve itself. He has known this could happen. He has seen the reports. He has heard the warnings from men like Nagano and Koga, the men who stared at production tables and realized that Japan's opponent was not only the fleet at sea, but the nation behind it. Now the nation is here, in the form of carrier decks that never seem to empty. The next Japanese strike is launched because it must be. There is no alternative. If Japan does not press, she is defeated anyway. If she presses, she might still land a blow that changes something. But the strikes keep bleeding away into the American fighter screen. The loss rate is brutal. Pilots with limited training meet pilots with better radar control, better coordination, and aircraft supplied by factories that can replace them without pause. When American counter-strikes come, they arrive with a weight that feels different from 1942. It is not a daring raid. It is a scheduled hammering. American dive bombers and torpedo planes break through, guided by radar, by scouting aircraft, by a network that has matured into dominance. They find Japanese carriers and fall upon them in disciplined waves. Explosions bloom, flight decks shudder, fires race, fuel and bombs cook off. Smoke rises in towering columns that can be seen for miles. Men run across decks that have become furnaces. Firefighting crews drag hoses through wreckage. Officers scream orders that vanish in the roar. A plane, fully fueled, breaks loose and slides into flames. Another detonates. The ship's steel seems to groan as if in pain. Ozawa watches reports come in, each one a cut. Carrier damaged, carrier burning, carrier sinking. Each message is more than a tactical loss. It is a production loss that Japan cannot erase. And that is the point where the fear becomes more than fear. It becomes certainty. Because even if Ozawa could sink an American carrier today, tomorrow another would appear. Another would rotate in. Another would replace it, accompanied by escorts, by oilers, by aircraft, by trained pilots drawn from a pipeline that has not been starved. For Japan, each carrier lost is a limb gone forever. The Battle of the Philippine Sea grinds on, and the Japanese air arm is shattered in what American aviators will later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The nickname is cruel, almost casual, and it reflects something terrifying for the Americans. This kind of victory has become expected. For Japan, it is catastrophic. In Tokyo, the men who once argued about decisive battle now face a world where the decisive moment has been claimed by the enemy. The decisive factor is not the skill of a night torpedo run, not the bravery of a pilot, not even the brilliance of an admiral's plan. It is the ability to build, to train, to supply, and to do it again and again without breaking. Japan's admirals feared America's industrial power because it made the Pacific Ocean feel smaller to the United States and larger to Japan. It turned distance into an advantage for the Americans. It turned loss into something manageable. It turned the war into a calculation that Japan could not win. And in the smoke over the Philippine Sea, with carriers burning and pilots missing and the horizon filled with American force, that fear finally takes its full shape. Not a suspicion, not a warning, a verdict.